Forced to work from home by your employer? Laid off or feeling depressed at home? Do you want to make money working from anywhere? We'll show you how to do it from your couch. It's time for another episode of the Work From Home Show. Coming to you from their homes in Austin, Texas and Tampa, Florida, here are your hosts, Adam and Naresh.
Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Work From Home Show. I'm Naresh with Adam Schrader, and today we have Casey Mulligan on the show. He is an internationally renowned economist, professor of economics at the University of Chicago, former chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors in the Trump administration, author of the best-selling book, The Redistribution Recession, How Labor Market Distortions Contracted the Economy, and the new book, You're Hired, Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President. Casey Mulligan, welcome to the Work From Home Show.
Yeah, nice to meet with you guys.
Yeah, and I thought it was relevant to bring on a well-known, famed, knowledgeable economist because a lot happened in the year 2020 with regard to the economy, as you know, and you wrote books about the 2008-2009 recession and how the Federal Reserve and the federal government under two completely different administrations, the Bush administration and the Obama administration, how they handled those. So when it comes to 2020, the pandemic, it looks like a double dip type of, I don't want to call it a double dip recession. Maybe we never exited the recession, but a double dip as far as lockdowns go. What has the government and our medical leaders as well, because for some reason they've been running our economy or trying to run our economy, what have they done correctly and what have they done incorrectly?
Well, in the spring, there was everybody was very cautious. Both the governments and the citizens. I don't think even the governments made that much of a difference. They did close things, schools and other things, but those things would have closed themselves, I think, where everybody was cautious. We were learning, about the virus and its disease and how to deal with it in different ways. And it made sense. It was a massive, really a depression. I think the economy was maybe 20% smaller than usual, almost overnight. That made sense for a short period of time until we got to learn things. I'd say the biggest mistake has been around schooling, not having the kids in school after that initial caution period, which I understand. We learned, and especially from other countries that didn't close their schools, even during the caution period, that it's not a source of spread of the disease. Kids are not really harmed from it. And what they are harmed from is being stuck at home in front of a Zoom screen, if they even log in. And their education really being set back. Even as we speak this week, there are many, many public schools that the school building is closed to the children. And that's a big ongoing mistake.
Yeah, especially when you look at the impact that has on, the parents. And you can't fully reopen the society and the economy until you have a bunch of kids back in school. Now, I have a little bit different pandemic thoughts than Naresh does, and we don't need to get into that. But how have you seen, what are your thoughts on how the federal government has, how they've reacted to this recession and the COVID and the recession that occurred because of it, and then comparing that to how the government reacted during the Great Recession, and what are your thoughts on the response on each of them?
If you remember back 2009, over 10 years ago, obviously it was a pretty deep recession. Employment was down. At the time, they were putting together that legislation, the so-called stimulus legislation. Economy was down about 10% in terms of employment. And they decided, we need a little bit extra unemployment in this situation. So they said a $25 a week bonus. That's what we'll have. And that was Democratic Congress, Democratic president, as you mentioned. And now, fast forward to today, And now the economy, I think, as we speak today, is maybe down 5%. So half as much down as when we wrote that legislation earlier. But there are a lot of so-called serious people who are saying we should have a $600 bonus, not $25, but it should be $600, so 20 times bigger or more for a recession that's now half as deep where we are sitting now. That's a very different response. And I'm not sure that it's really proportionate to the situation. I'd say we made a mistake. I even think maybe the bonus was a mistake back then, but certainly multiplying that bonus by 20 something is far disproportionate to what we're dealing with.
What type of back to work incentives should the government offer to promote people to get back to work and promote economic growth?
I mean, there's always a balancing act. Arthur Oken called it the equity efficiency trade-off. Some people are in a tough situation. They lost a job, and you want to help them out. You don't want their standard of living to suffer too much. That's the equity consideration. But then there's an efficiency consideration. If the more you pay them for not working, the less likely they are going to be to work. And that's a balancing act. It's not new. This has been understood for centuries. And, in the United States, we had reached that balancing act. Well, we'll replace about half of your pay, maybe a little more than half. And that's the balancing act that we want to achieve. Obama and the Democratic Congress said, well, maybe half plus $25. But that's really the balancing act. And I would say, well, you would want to continue that balancing act. You don't need these huge bonuses and put people in a situation where they earned 100% of their former pay, or in many cases beyond 100%. I think that makes no sense. And it's something that Americans would have recognized as making no sense 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago.
Now, one of the things you discuss in your book is kind of about how when people, even though companies were losing people, they became more efficient and things were going, really well production-wise. And we're seeing that throughout society, throughout all the years that things have been going on. What are your thoughts, especially now as people have been laid off and companies are becoming more efficient still, in regards to like a job guarantee or something like that, where people can find work whenever they get displaced by more efficient measures? Because right now, a lot of, we have a high unemployment rate, and the question is how many of those jobs are going to actually come back?
Well, I don't know that it's that high. 6.9% was the October number, which seems so high to us.
Right. Historically, it's not that high, but whenever you're coming from 3.5% like we were back in March or April or whenever we peaked.
Well, I think you want to get perspective, and that's always helpful in anything you do in life, is to have perspective. And then, where it's at 6.9. Now, there's some industries where it was much more than 6.9, and of course, other industries where it's less. And this recession, I think, is different on how concentrated it is in industries, at least where we sit right now. And May was maybe a different story. So I could see, some kind of programs for the travel industry and those type of industries. But this has not been really an issue of people being replaced by robots or something like that. This has been, there's a virus out there. It's still out there as we speak. And some jobs are less safe, or let me say at least less comfortable for people when that virus is out there. And that virus will not be out there forever. And so those type of industries can recover and will when things are normal in terms of the health situation.
Now, I kind of have a little bit of an issue with unemployment on the whole. I think unemployment, and you're probably not going to be surprised hearing what I've said so far, whenever I say I subscribe and I believe mostly in what the modern monetary theory puts forward, and that's that unemployment is caused because capitalism in and of itself, which is no problem, thrives on becoming more efficient. When you become more efficient, you don't need as many workers. And so whenever we look at the unemployment in and of itself means that you have people actively searching for work. So isn't a 6.9 or even 3.5% unemployment too high? You have 3 or 4 or 6 or 7 out of every 100 people out there looking for work who can't find it because our society has become more efficient. What do you think should be done in those situations? Like, do we just say, sorry, y'all are out of luck to the unemployed?
Well, we haven't said that for at least 100 years. So no, I would not suggest beginning saying that. We have lots of programs. In fact, dozens of federal programs, not to mention state programs for people in situation. I think it's wrong to characterize or to view it as normal or average that people aren't able to find work. We have known statistics on the duration of unemployment, and that can be a few months would be normal. Now, you do get, like any distribution, there's a tail, and there's some people who might go years without finding work. But the norm is a month or 2 or 3. And that's part of the world being dynamic. We like new things in life, and that means we have to find new places to move to and new jobs to go to, new skills to learn. The Marxists promised they would get rid of unemployment, and they did in a sense, but they shut down all progress. I mean, progress is the enemy because they wanted to be able to do things just like they did yesterday. And a lot more people suffered from that attitude than having, as you said, 4% of the workforce at any point in time who's looking for work, and most of whom will find it within a few months. That's the dynamic of the economy. Now, we don't say those people get no help. We haven't said that for a century. Those people do get some help, but they also have some incentive. I mean, in some reward when they do find the thing for them, that's a benefit for them. They're doing better when they find it than they were when they weren't finding it.
Casey, how do you consider work from home and the digitization of everything, as well as artificial intelligence, in your economic policies?
Well, in my own profession, we've had digitization, computerization has been a big deal over my generation, the previous generations. We used to do, if you look at Milton Friedman, who would be a couple generations older than me, when he was a grad student and a young professor-aged person, he was inverting matrices by hand. You guys probably don't even know what that means. I mean, that's not something we do anymore. Computers do it. And there would have been people concerned at the time, well, if we let the machines do this exercise, then what are the Milton Friedmans and his classmates going to do with their time? Because the machine can do it, and the machine does invert a matrix so much better than a person. But the result of that is there was a huge demand for statistical analysis because it got so much cheaper. And in fact, my profession's become more statistical when there came in machines to do the statistical work. I mean, more of the humans in my profession do statistical work than they used to before because of the machines. And now we do a massive number of matrices that my typical colleague would invert, maybe 1 million a month or something like that. I mean, they're doing a massive volume of work due to the machine. So you have a lot of industries like that. Now you have others like agriculture. You remember that great novel, The Grapes of Wrath, or maybe you've seen the film.
Yep, John Steinbeck.
That's a case where automation came in, and they didn't increase the amount of food we wanted. And we did have more food, but we couldn't eat all the food that farmers could make with the machine. So it meant there was going to be fewer farmers. And you had that, and that Grapes of Wrath was about the tough transition, but it was a transition. They ended up in California. Be interesting to see how their descendants did. They got the land very cheap. So, it's a tough transition, but it's a transition you want to make if you want to have a dynamic economy, I think, which we all do.
Well, I'm just wondering, and look, Adam shared his thoughts on where he is with modern monetary theory. And I lean right just ideologically. It's no secret to our listeners, I voted Republican down the line, voted for Trump. But there are some parts of modern monetary theory, for example, that I'm actually open to. And as a follow-up to my previous question, I just wonder, okay, well, you talked about digitization and technology, and there's so many workers who don't have those skills, who were working at the restaurants and the travel industry. What are they supposed to do moving forward? And how does this tie into your thoughts on Andrew Yang's proposal for a universal basic income?
Okay, well, the restaurants and travel are going to come back. Virus gone, restaurants and travel back. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that all Americans are going to enjoy travel.
Yeah.
Those of us who live in the North will like to go to the South in the winter. Those of us who right now are slaving over the stove and experimenting with recipes are going to like to have a chef make it for us. There's no question in my mind that that's happening. Now, how long is the virus going to be around? I mean, people debate that, but the debate is talking in months, weeks, something like that. And so I don't think your chef is going to need to be a computer programmer. He's going to be a chef pretty soon again.
What would you do to prepare the society, the government, everybody for kind of economically for the next big thing like this that comes around, whether it's another virus or whether it's something that kind of makes people have to stay home or do something? What can we do as a society to kind of pandemic proof ourselves?
I think more generally, you want to be have a flexible labor market that can deal with change. And the U.S. has always been pretty good on that by a worldwide scale. And I think you saw that in some of the economic results. The European economies have suffered more. So it's tougher for an employer to fire a worker in many of the European countries than it is here. And there's a lot of sand in the gears. And so those transitions are tough. In a European country, it's tougher to be an employer of low-skilled people, which is not a good thing because, maybe the day comes when your chef can't be a chef anymore. Maybe a machine's replaced him. Employers need to be out there, entrepreneurs, to say, how can I put these people to use? And if I have a clever way to figure out, well, here's a job that we'll do, here's a product that we'll make that uses these people who are lacking the skills that are in vogue today, that entrepreneur ought to be rewarded and not punished. And a lot of the labor market regulations really are hard on employers of low-skilled people.
So you said travel and vacations and restaurants will bounce back. Do you also think the work from home movement is temporary, or do you think it's going to be permanent where companies are going to tell their employees, hey, you know what, just stay at home, keep working from home. We don't want to pay for the commercial lease?
I think a lot of that is temporary. I can't see you guys, so I don't know how old you are, but we had this when the internet first came around. There was talk about, we're all going to work from home in the cities. You can kiss cities goodbye. We can all live in the Rocky Mountains or wherever our favorite spot in nature is. And actually what you saw with the internet is actually made the cities grow bigger and more concentrated, especially in terms of a skilled workforce. And because there's these two effects, it's kind of like what I talked about Milton Friedman and inverting the matrices. When we have Zoom, yes, there's less, for any given transaction, there's less need for me to be in downtown Chicago or downtown New York or downtown London. That's true. But I'm going to want to have more relationships with people in downtown New York and people in downtown London because it's cheaper for me to do that. I don't have to be there every day or every week or whatever it was. So post-pandemic, I think you're going to have a lot of us who were maybe in New York 2 weeks a month. I'll find we're only going to be there 1 week a month or even 2 days a month. But there are more of us who want to be in New York because of that. So those are the kind of two trade-offs. And it's not just the internet episode. I mean, there's been contagious diseases in cities before, and the journalists always put the cities to rest and said, this is it, cities are over. And the premature death of cities has been pronounced so many times. I'm certainly not going to be one to pronounce it for the nth time and be wrong again.
Well, I'm glad you bring up that point because you're actually the first guest we've had who's not taken the side of cities are over, work from home is permanent, commercial real estate is collapsing.
T.W. Lewis did.
Oh, you're right. Yeah, TW. Yeah, we did have one. We did have one guest, but that was a while ago. So it's great to hear that perspective. But I'm not sure you have the data and the research more than I do. But from what I've seen, there has been this migration out of these major cities. There has, at least what I've, unless the news.
No, you're right. You're right. During the pandemic, no doubt, and also true during past contagious diseases. People get the heck out of the cities while it's contagious, no doubt. But the question is, what's going to happen when the virus is going away? We all agree it's going away. And when it goes away, what's going to happen? And there we have a long history, not only of what's happened to the cities, they all come back from this, but we also have a lot of studies of the journalists talking about what the cities are going to do. And the journalists are wrong every damn time. Now, maybe they're the squirrel who finds the acorn this time, but I don't think there's any data to support that cities aren't coming back.
Well, I agree in terms of, people will move back to, New York City, Chicago, and those cities eventually. But why, coming from a, capitalism standpoint, you talk about, doing the efficiency and cutting out the fat. Why wouldn't companies be incentivized to, reduce their footprint in the offices and cut that overhead and pay people the same amount just to work from home if they can?
Well, they will do some of that, but that goes to my point. I mean, just like when Milton Friedman in his day, the computer learned how to invert that matrix, you would say, well, wouldn't they just use the computer? Aren't they incentivized to do that? Hell yeah, they're incentivized to do that. But you're taking as given how many businesses want to have a New York presence in a world where you can have a smaller footprint while you have your New York presence. And so those are the two things you're trading off. Each business will have a smaller presence, whether it's measured in footprint or number of employees there per week or a fraction of employee time that's in the city limits or on Manhattan. Those numbers will shrink, but the number of businesses want to engage in that will grow. And that's kind of the horse race. And the second one has been winning the horse race, certainly in the internet age.
Because I was just thinking, you were talking about how you thought the work from home movement was more temporary. So why would you think it would be temporary as opposed to businesses saying, hey, stay home, we don't have to pay as much?
No, it would be the businesses that are already in New York will have more working at home. But then you'll have all these businesses who aren't in New York. There are many businesses not in New York, not in cities even.
Of course.
And they will be more incentivized to have a New York part of their business because it's cheaper, and they will also be working from home, but we'll be commuting occasionally to New York because that's where you're going to meet people or do whatever you do with lots of people nearby.
Sticking to the topic of mass migration, by the way, we have Casey Mulligan on the show, professor of economics at the University of Chicago, author of the new book, You're Hired, Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President. But talking about this migration out of cities, I've seen some of the craziest videos and footage of these riots that have happened. I've watched at least hundreds of these, and they're real. They're real videos. Do you think these riots and the protests and BLM and all this looting do you think that had any impact in this migration out of these cities, or is it just for media hits?
I'll tell you for sure. I live in Chicago. I have neighbors, and I have neighbors who left in July when the Chicago riots were at their peak because they were scared to go with their kids and look out the window. They didn't like looking out the window and seeing that, and they were gone. It's no question. Now, the city's always been a life cycle for most people, that when you're younger and you don't need a big place to live and you don't have a lot of kids or your kids are small, you're in the city, and then you move out as your kids go older. The city schools are terrible, right? The public schools. and you move out to the suburb where they got better schooling for your kids. And so a lot of these people that I have in my mind, my neighbors who moved, are moving out of the city maybe 3, 4, 5 years earlier than they were gonna anyway. And that's another way it'll come back. It won't be those individuals coming back to the city, but there'll be a new generation of younger people coming in the city. I assume the riots and so on are not permanent. I mean, they make no sense. They have very little benefit for people, and they have a lot of costs. I would assume that they'll
$2 billion worth of damage.
Yeah, well, not to mention that the city residents don't enjoy it. Let me put it mildly, right? And so I think our political system is not great, but it's good enough to detect that can't go on, and we need to have some policing and some penalties for people who break the law and stuff like that. So I would expect that would come back. And crime's been a problem in cities before, and we beat it. So I think we can do it again.
Well, just as an aside, I'm not really a voter. Like I don't really bother to vote. I just hold a different philosophy. But those riots that happened starting in late May, that was like the deciding factor for me to get out and vote, because I thought that just completely crossed the line, and it was. I don't even think anarchy is the right word. If you read the classical definition of anarchy, that's not. This was just straight, illegal violence and looting, and I mean it was terrible. It was and it went on for like 5 months, and I don't know why the government or the local governments couldn't do more, but it was just never ending. And I don't blame your neighbors for moving out. I don't blame them at all. And I'm glad that I live in a place that doesn't have to deal with that. If I drive 20 miles north of here, there are some areas that face some issues. But I think initially I wouldn't say I was afraid to go out because of the pandemic or the virus, but I was even more afraid to go out at night because of the violence and what I was seeing on Twitter and social media and TV. The media wouldn't even report on a lot of it because the media heavily swings left. But it was out there. And if you just drove around, you could see it for yourself. And I don't know how, I think that certainly affected people's work habits and people's living habits.
Yeah, there's no question. There was a big time in their life to see that out their window and see that they're walking down the street with the kids. They're doing their normal daily life, and now all of a sudden it becomes dangerous.
So now let's talk really quickly about your latest book, Your Hired Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President. So that populist president is obviously President Trump. You were the chief economist for his Council of Economic Advisors during his administration. Let's talk about some of the failures, because to me, clearly, the bulk of the country thought that he was, when I say bulk, I mean over 50%, thought that he was a failed president and had failed policies. I think his policies were great. I think just the timing, 2020, anybody who was president would have lost the election in 2020. It was just a terrible year in general. But what were some of his failures as a populist president?
Well, he promised to drain the swamp, and he did some of that. I mean, it really is a swamp, and that the special interests are there writing the rules, holding the pen for the government employees as they make the rules. And I have a chapter in the book about car companies doing that, shipping companies doing that. I have a chapter in there about how pharmaceutical companies tried to do that. And at the time I published the book, the president did not allow them. But actually, we just had in the past couple of weeks, he did the regulations that will allow Big Pharma to make more money off the taxpayers and off the consumers. I mean, and it's a tough problem. I mean, one of the reasons that's happening, that particular thing's happening, is his health secretary, is a former pharma company president. And you could say, well, don't put those people in charge. The problem is these government agencies are so huge and complicated. If you're not an insider, they'll eat you alive. In fact, they did eat alive his health secretary who was before that. He was not an insider, and the bureaucracy just chewed him up and spat him out. So he had to bring in an insider, somebody who had experience, but this is also somebody who's attached to the industry. And in fact, he brags about all his great pharma resume. He's attached to the industry. He's invested. He worked in the government before, so he's invested in the failed policies of the past, which is exactly what the populist president is trying to undo. It's a very tricky situation, and I'm not sure I would blame him, but this is a fact that he's failed to drain the swamp in a number of ways. He did drain it in some ways, and I'm glad for that. But I aspire that he could do better in the second term, perhaps. But there's plenty of special interests very active against really most Americans.
Yeah, Naresh knows that I'm not a Republican, but I will say when Trump was elected, I did hope that he would drain the swamp, and that, he talked about like building up the infrastructure, spending, and all of that, and I was hopeful. It obviously, like you were saying, the draining the swamp didn't really happen, and now we see, now we're going to see Biden come in, and he's just reloading the swamp to the hilt. I mean, I have a very low bar for what's going to happen in the next 4 years, and I'm not really expecting him to clear it. Do you think Trump's going to run again in 24?
I do. I don't have inside information to that, except that I've heard Mulvaney say it. We've all, I think, heard Mulvaney say it, but I know Mulvaney well, and I really trust his judgment on these things. I think he will. The funny thing is, I think a lot of the voters you mentioned who voted against him because they didn't want to hear his Twitter anymore. But they're still going to hear his Twitter anyway, because he's still going to be allowed to tweet. And if it's not tweet, it's going to be Parler. And the news can say, oh, well, we won't report on it because he's not
They're
president.
They're going to report on it.
Because it's in their financial interest to report on what he's got to say.
Well, so he'll probably start his own media empire, too. So they'll have that, too.
So he'll be down in Florida tweeting away. And so people who voted for that are not going to get it. And they're going to get Biden's policy and not the civil society or whatever it's considered, the non-Twitter approach of President Trump. That's still going to be there. But 4 years goes by as fast. He'll probably declare his campaign on January 21. Wouldn't surprise me.
Wow. That wouldn't surprise me either. But draining the swamp was one of the reasons why I supported him. I didn't vote in 2016, but just a lot of the ideas, the whole drain the swamp and the deep state and the fake news media. This is stuff that I was talking about for years and years, and I was like, are we ever going to get a politician who's going to call out these enemies? And we got someone, not a politician, but we got somebody who ran as a politician who finally did it, and that was a major reason why I started to like him and why I was hopeful that he would be reelected in 2020. And I think economically, and look, you're part of, kudos to you because you're the chief economist for him, for his administration. But economically, I think he was just going through history in my lifetime. I was not alive I was not born when Reagan was president. But I think economically, he's the best president we've had in my lifetime. And I agree with, almost 100% of what he did from 2017 through the end of 2019 economically. So props to you and for him for that.
Thank you. Actually, there's a Reagan versus Trump chapter. And actually, Trump, I think, is better than Reagan on Reagan's own terms. Reagan is kind of grown in the years in legend. And he did some great things. But Trump did even more. And a lot of the economic progress really was draining the swamp. So I have a chapter in the book, for example, about prescription drug prices and how companies had manipulated that system to be able to charge an arm and a leg for a generic drug. Because a generic drug is an old drug. It's been invented. Everybody knows the formula. We all know how it works. And they had gamed the FDA so that they could make tons of money selling generics. And Trump ended that right away. Their stocks crashed. and prescription drug prices fell for the first time in 46 years. Trump says the first time in 51, and he's wrong. He's exaggerating, but that's you have a dozen examples like that important and of that type of draining the swamp, and you get real economic progress. Now, we could drain it more and have more progress. I agree. That's why it's called Successes and Failures. But it actually had successes, and there are other presidents, I would say, who wouldn't have any of those drain the swamp type of successes.
Casey Mulligan, professor of economics at the University of Chicago, as we mentioned multiple times, former chief economist for the Council of Economic Advisors during the Trump administration, author of the best-selling book, The Redistribution Recession, How Labor Market Distortions Contracted the Economy, and his most recent book, You're Hired, Untold Successes and Failures of a Populist President. That president was President Trump. The website is economics.uchicago.edu, economics.uchicago.edu, also bfi.uchicago.edu, bfi.uchicago.edu. Professor Mulligan, any other final thoughts you want to share with our listeners about your books, about you, about anything else you want to promote?
Yeah, well, I have a website for the book. We have some videos, for example, of President Trump talking about some of the topics in the book. It's called yourhiredtrump.com. And that's a lot of fun. In fact, my book has a social media bibliography, so you can see not just lists of books and articles that have been published in paper, but those that are online. And so you can poke through and see, oh, here's Trump, how his thinking has evolved on the individual mandate or what have you. You can see all that in video. And he's a fun, even if you don't like him, he's a fun guy to listen to. He's quite a character.
Casey Mulligan, thanks so much for joining us on the Work From Home Show. And to all our listeners, check out our website, workfromhomeshow.com. Get on our mailing list, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. We'll be sending you some kind of freebie goodie. And if you have any questions, hello@workfromhomeshow.com. That's hello@workfromhomeshow.com. Until next time, keep on working from home.